And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and our next guest is Andrew Keen. Andrew is an author. He is a columnist. He is an internet entrepreneur. For those of you who go back on the internet a ways, he founded audiocafe.com back in the 90s. He has a podcast. He has a column for CNN. And his new book is called The Internet is Not the Answer. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. I have everything, don't I?
Well, you know, you have a lot. Everything is a broad. We are here to puncture overly broad claims, but you have a lot.
I have everything now. This is my final piece of the puzzle.
Excellent. All right. Well, it's great to have you. And I have to say, I'm not an effusive person by nature, but I loved your book. I think that this is a terrific book, and I wanted to talk to you about it. And one of the things that struck me about it, well, we'll talk a little bit about it, and then maybe about how you came to write it, because you're not known especially as a biting critic of the internet culture, but or the Silicon Valley culture, but yet you certainly have some pointed criticism. So let's start with this, the obvious question. Back in the 60s, when people were saying love is the answer, there was a graffiti that said, well, what was the question? So the internet is not the answer to what?
So that's a great question. The internet is not at the moment the answer. Maybe we missed that little bit out of the title. At the moment, the internet is not the answer to an effective operating system for the 21st century. Your listeners will know that everything is in dramatic flux. All the old industries are being undermined. There's chaos out there. More and more people are losing their jobs. You're seeing it across industries. And the internet and the digital revolution is sweeping away old industries like the music industry, the newspaper industry, the publishing industry. Now it's sweeping away the taxicab industry and the hotel industry and replacing it with companies like Google and Airbnb and Spotify and Facebook. But at the moment, the internet is not the answer because it's not working. This new platform isn't functioning properly. It's, if you like, dysfunctional. It's actually compounding many of the problems of the late part of the 20th and early part of the 21st century, compounding problems of inequality and unemployment. And above all else, it's created this new big data economy where everything we do, everywhere we go, everything we say, everything indeed maybe even we think is being recorded and known by these companies. We've been turned into the products in this new platform. We've been packaged up as the products, and we're all working for free for these companies.
Well, a lot of people would say, we're talking with Andrew Keen, author of The Internet is Not the Answer. A lot of people would say and do say, well, so what? I don't care if they know everything about me. I don't care if I'm producing the... now, I've written a little bit about this myself, so I have my own opinions, but a lot of people say, well, I don't care if Facebook knows everything about what I've done last year, and I don't care if I produced all the product that Facebook creates. What's the problem?
Well, there will be people whose lives are open books, and I have to say I feel sorry for those people, because if you don't have secrets, you're doing something wrong.
Right.
And for those people who are willing to live completely in public and have a faceless, nameless corporation or set of corporations knowing everything about them and having their lives sort of punctuated or dominated by advertisers who know as much about them, then they're welcome to that world. But I think the majority of people do care. And I also think the majority of people don't quite understand what's going on. Let's take Google. Google is a company that makes its money through the sale of data. Now, they're not personally, Larry Page is not personally looking at your or my search results and saying, oh, Richard is looking at this site or Andrew is doing this or this. But collectively, they are joining the dots on our online behavior. So it's not just on Google search. It's on YouTube, which is owned by Google. It's on Gmail, which is owned by Google. It's on, eventually, Google self-driving cars and Google glasses. Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, famously said a few years ago, that Google's ambition was to know more about us than we know ourselves, wanted to know what jobs we want, what we wanted to do that day. This is not a world that any of us really want. We don't want to be second-guessed all the time. We don't want to be driving past a restaurant in our self-driving Google car and suddenly our favorite restaurant, and suddenly a little ad pops up saying 50% off today. The world loses its serendipity. There are no longer any accidents in this kind of world, and I don't think many people really want that.
And I think you touch on something very important. We're talking with Andrew Keen, author of the new book, The Internet is Not the Answer. I think you've touched on something very important here. And by the way, neither of us, I should say, are anti-technology. You know, I have a background in tech a bit, and you have an extensive background in it. We're not talking from the point of view of reflexive hostility to all technology, but we are saying here, and you are saying, it's not just that they collect data, and you touched on this. This is, I think, a very important point. It's that the way in which the data is used, I suppose that should be are used, but nobody uses it in the plural form. The way that the data is used by these large companies shapes our reality in some concrete ways. It shapes what's presented to us. It shapes not only the advertisements we see, but the content that may spontaneously appear before us. It even shapes the pricing that's offered to us, right?
Yeah, and I think you've hit on something really important. The Internet was promised to us as this global village, this place that would enlarge our horizons, make us more broader thinkers, make us more, give different foreign ideas more accessibility. But actually the reverse is true. The Internet has become this very, very narrow echo chamber where the ads we see, the links we see, all of it is geared by our behavior. So when we went on television, 50% of the ads weren't relevant to us, but we were never quite sure what 50%. And you never know. Maybe one day you might buy that truck. You might use that perfume. You might have reason to buy this kind of food or that kind of drink. But on the Internet, everything that's served up confirms what we already think. And it reflects also the cultural world of places like Facebook, where we, where our very narrow taste is fed back to us, right, where we congregate ideologically and culturally in groups. We have no access to other people's thinking. In contrast, say, with a newspaper, where in the old-fashioned newspaper, an editorial page of a left-wing newspaper like the New York Times or a right-wing newspaper like the Wall Street Journal would at least have dissent. There's less and less dissent. So this world is actually compounding the divisions and the lack of real discourse that's, I think, corrupting our current society. We can't blame the Internet for all of this, just like we can't blame the Internet for inequality or unemployment, but it's compounding these deeply rooted problems.
And let's talk about, well, a couple of things I want to talk about. First is, it seems to me also that there's a lack of, or a erosion, I should say, of shared cultural experiences. I mean, everybody, you know, the sort of proverbial water cooler experience of, can you believe that ad they ran on the Super Bowl last night, or watching the moon landing, or whatever it might be, that somehow instead everyone is being presented a fragmented, individualized reality that consists of their own, a reinforcement of their own curiosities and biases, and that of their friends fed back to them 24/7. Is there a kind of atomization or social entropy that takes place as a result of that?
Yeah, Richard, we're beginning to sound like the Internet. We agree too much. You're absolutely right. There's this cult of the social and of social media on the Internet. Everyone talks about collaboration and social and community, but the truth is quite the reverse. Social media is actually atomizing, alienating, fragmenting us. On the Internet, we're alone. On the Internet, we're more and more solitary. It's a kind of prison of the self. And you see it in cultural terms. You see it with the obsession with selfies. You see it in the way in which we use the Internet to broadcast ourselves. And the social becomes an extension of ourselves. So we join a social group, a social network, but it's always really just an extension of ourselves. So we join and then we leave communities. And I think this explains the weakness of many of the supposedly social political movements that have arisen online. Occupy, for example, whose ideology I'm actually kind of sympathetic with, didn't really go anywhere because it was just a collection of individuals. Even their website was a kind of a collage of individual voices without anything connecting them. So the old world was social. The physical world was social. The digital world, I'm afraid, is more and more individualized, lonelier and lonelier, more and more alienating and fragmented.
Well, I'm getting bummed out now, but we will pivot at some point in this interview, I promise, to some positive thoughts. But it's interesting you mentioned Occupy, Andrew Keen, because to me, I was quite sympathetic to the Occupy movement, but it may in part have foundered because of this notion of everyone. It was almost an attempt to take the culture of the internet into real space, into the physical world. And you seem to be suggesting that may have been why it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, you got 90. So we're all against the 1%. Fine, but there's a big difference between the 98th percentile and who makes a few million a year and the bottom 1% percentile living on the street. So that's the first thing. Now I'm not sure if necessarily that the internet's to blame for that, but I think the key thing in Occupy was that everyone had a voice. Everyone in Occupy wanted to tell a story. So on the Occupy website, you had these individual voices all explaining how the economic crisis has affected them. They were all legitimate, very moving, very troubling stories. But there was no one knitting them together. There was no common ideology. What does Occupy stand for? Apart from these collective voices, apart from the 99%, which is so amorphous as to be meaningless. And I think what's lacking there is ideology. What's lacking there is a coherent notion of what to do, which involves compromise, which involves people banging their heads together. And one of the troubling things about the decline of political parties and the rise of these online organizations is I think ultimately when you have these online organizations of the 99%, they're not really tied together by anything, so they're very, very vulnerable to cult leadership and mob rule. Now, that didn't necessarily happen with Occupy, although it did a little bit. But you've seen with other online movements in Italy, for example, with Beppe Grillo, you see the development of these charismatic online leadership cults driving an angry crowd. Imagine if the internet had been around in the 1930s. I'm certain it would have been a great friend of the fascists.
Right, and I think what you're describing, we're going to have to take a quick break. I think what you're describing is a breakdown of social cohesion. I could be wrong, but we'll talk when we come back a little bit more about it. We're speaking with Andrew Keen, author of The Internet is Not the Answer, and we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and we are speaking with Andrew Keen, author of the new book, The Internet is Not the Answer. Now, when we went to break, Andrew, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed to me that what you were describing was a breakdown in social cohesion where people adhere to one another in some Post-it notes sort of loose, connectivity on the internet, but are easily swayed by the loudest, the harshest, the mob rule type voice. Is that a fair summary of where you were going?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to your original question about what the internet isn't the answer for. We've got the breakdown of the old order, which you can't blame on the internet. With or without the internet, the industrial society was being replaced by something else. So the internet becomes the kind of replacement. It's how we do our business, it's how we network, it's how we organize politically. But once again, the atomization, which in some ways resulted in the breakdown, the economic forces which have undermined the power of large organizations, the rise of what writers call the free agent nation as we become our own brands, all those forces of individualism are a product of broad economic forces. And the Internet itself compounds those. It's an ideal platform for a free agent nation, but it dresses itself up in social terms. But it's true. The truth is, it's really just a platform for individuals. Some people do very well out of it. I do. I'm sure you do. We understand how this system works. We understand that the Internet is a kind of platform for building brand, for developing our services. But for many people, who don't understand this hyper-competitive world, it's very troubling.
Well, and I think also there's the notion that this is somehow a people-driven platform when it is increasingly, it appears to me, a corporate-driven platform. And it seems to me also that gets overlooked. I mean, I know at one point, I think we were brought together in part over something that I had written, which suggested that there's nothing the large internet companies are doing now that would be unfamiliar to the railroad tycoons of the 19th century, which is if you take away the trappings of the new technology and of the rhetoric of the people's platform and all of that, what you have left are people whose business model is a very simple one: grab a monopolistic or near monopolistic market share and then use it to brutalize your suppliers and exploit your customers. Am I being unfair, overly simplistic?
Not at all, Richard. And let's use three examples there. Look at Amazon. Amazon is announced in the name of the people. And on one level, it's a wonderful product, a wonderful service. It sells cheap. It's reliable. It has an extremely intuitive website. So on one level, it's created a kind of cult of the consumer, which is great for us. But ultimately, it's not great for us. Firstly, it's not great for us because of those low prices are driven by extremely exploitative labor practices. So the people who work at Amazon are paid badly, not allowed to form into unions. I don't think that's really good for any of us. Secondly, the success of Amazon has destroyed local bookstores and many other local retail outlets. So again, for us, if all we want to do is shop online, I guess it's okay. But if you care about your local bookstore, if you care about your local record store, Amazon's a disaster. And thirdly, it's created this kind of cult of the consumer, which has allowed Amazon to bully publishers. So if you care about books, ultimately, Amazon's attitude to publishers of bullying them more and more, of demanding larger and larger margins, is putting small and large publishers out of business. In my book, I talk about Amazon describing publishers as gazelles. And of course, Amazon being the lion, eating those publishers. The same is true of Airbnb and Uber. These are
I don't want to go off
financed plays to monopolize $40 billion for Uber, $10 billion for Airbnb, all platform attempts to dominate massive global industries.
Right, and I want to. I want to go back to the Amazon example for a second. There's certainly a lot that could be said about Airbnb and Uber, other than positive nature. But I want to get to them. But Amazon and the publishers is an important example to me, not just because, as you said, it's brutalizing publishers who are not, saints either, but they're clearly using their monopsonistic, they would say, role to brutalize these suppliers, but also to, in my opinion, break the covenant with their own consumers. As you know, one of Amazon's techniques for putting pressure on the publishers was to have the purchase button, the buy now button, not appear on its adversary, on the websites of books, or I'm sorry, on the pages for books with whom it had an adversarial relationship with the publisher. So I go to buy a book from Hachette or whoever they're fighting with, and I can't find the buy now page, or it tells me there's a 3-week delay when there is no 3-week delay in filling this book, and you might like this book by whoever, David Patterson instead. That to me is actually foul play. Not only to the publisher, but to me as a consumer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I don't think Amazon is a bad company intrinsically. I actually have a great deal of admiration for Jeff Bezos. I saw him speak a few weeks ago in New York. And he's incredibly articulate. He's much more of a grown-up, much more of a mensch than many of the kid Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. But the problem with Amazon is they have too much power. The problem with this new digital economy is it lends itself to a winner-take-all economy. You don't have two companies. You don't have Hertz and Avis. You don't have McDonald's and Burger King. You just have Amazon. You just have Facebook. Right. You just have Airbnb or Uber. And these monopolies, and Google is the ultimate one, are bad for the consumer. They're also bad for our innovation economy because whatever people like Peter Thiel argue, monopolies are bad for innovation. They stop innovation. If Microsoft hadn't been challenged by the EU, we never would have had Google. And Google now, I think, might be stymiing next generation Googles.
And you mentioned Peter Thiel, who is, for our listeners who don't know, the very successful investor who has also spoken up in favor of monopoly and is a fierce libertarian in the political world. Now, it's interesting to me because my other observation, which I believe is echoed in your book, we're talking with Andrew Keen, the author of The Internet is Not the Answer. My other observation is that it's particularly when if it's Uber or some of these folks, I do feel that a lot of Silicon Valley billionaires, you use, by the way, Andrew, the delicious phrase, rich. What was the word? Young white men in black limousines. I like that phrase. But a lot of these folks, they go in, they take advantage of government regulation or lack thereof to adopt a monopolistic position. They use a variety of technologies developed by the government in order, from the internet to much of the inner workings of our computers and phones and so on, in order to become wealthy. And then they use that wealth to spread an ideology that says the government does nothing good for us.
Exactly, and I'm very, very suspicious and critical of this kind of libertarianism. It's particularly manifested with a company like Uber that's hostile to all forms of government regulation because it's in their benefit to sweep those regulations away. And it's a massively Silicon Valley, Wall Street financed effort to create a global monopoly and sweep away thousands of small companies, thousands of little enterprises, and replace it with one giant global enterprise. So you're absolutely right. We need to be very, very suspicious of this kind of libertarianism. Government isn't the enemy. When done right, and it's not always done right, it's the solution. Look at the Industrial Revolution. Without government regulation, kids would still be working in factories. Without government regulation, we wouldn't be able to go outside because our cities would be so badly polluted. And so with government today, we need defense against these kind of massive plays. We need defense on the data front. Data is the new pollution. Data is the digital equivalent of pollution. And we need governments to push back against these companies because without government, we don't have anything.
And people have learned, by the way, with Uber, for example, they learned quite quickly that if they come to rely on Uber and there's a hurricane or a shooting a terrorist shooting in downtown Sydney, Australia, that they learn very quickly that all of a sudden it costs them $900 to go, or whatever.
Yeah, the stories on Uber are appalling. I mean, both in terms of the way in which Uber gouges riders when the weather's bad or when there's some unnatural event. And secondly, the way in which the lack of regulation on Uber results in drivers not being properly vetted and them attacking passengers or bullying passengers. This is not the kind of system. This is why the internet at the moment is not the answer. This is not the kind of system that we want. We don't want something totally unregulated, where anyone can drive a cab, where all the profit goes to a tiny corporation in Silicon Valley, and we're the consumer, we're the left to pay the bill, both literally and metaphorically.
Well, and it's interesting because the ideological aspect of it is that the Uber backers will tell you, and that name, by the way, Uber, what's up with that? But as they say, people will tell you, well, the market will take care of it because people will complain. The one case of the Uber car that was infested with hundreds of spiders. Well, I don't want to.
I don't know that one. That sounds like a good one.
Oh, yes. So I don't want to get in a car infested with hundreds of spiders. It would be scant comfort to me to know that I can complain about it and market forces may address it at some future date. Both the radical ideology involved in that and the fact that, look, if regulations go away and Uber dominates the market, there are going to be people who need to get away from a catastrophe and can't. So I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, I think Uber is, Uber to me sort of encapsulates my argument on so many fronts. It's got a billionaire CEO who uses his position to seduce young women, and he's acknowledged it publicly. It's got a senior VP who acknowledged that he went after, personally going after journalists who criticize the company and still has his job. It has a system which forces drivers to essentially buy cars. It doesn't allow the drivers to unionize. The drivers are on strike. They don't like it. The passengers are exploited. Everyone loses except a tiny group of investors who are making a remarkable fortune from its $40 billion private valuation. I mean, if you invested in Uber at the beginning, a $10,000 investment would be worth tens of millions of dollars now. So it's a financial play. It's a scam, essentially.
Right. Seems to be, and the scam is built on really questionable ethics at best, flouting regulations. I mean, and by the way, your list was by no means comprehensive in that there's also Uber has lied to its drivers by misinforming them about what New York City taxi regulations do and do not permit in order to prevent them from joining a competitor. It has lied to regulators. It has lied to customers. It has, it's really kind of a. It's really. And to be fair, not every company, not every internet company is Uber. Uber represents the worst in every respect. I think it's the parable of what not to do. Now, Airbnb I can be critical of, but it's a much better company. Google is a much better company. Google's a very successful company. Right, but I think
Uber
let me just jump
because I think it needs to be a lesson to other entrepreneurs.
Right, and I also think the important lesson of Uber, they seem to be kind of worse guys than some of the others, but also the other thing we didn't talk about is how they boasted that they could spy on a journalist and harm her personally because they had the what do they call it, the giant eye? I forget the name of it, the big eye.
Exactly. I don't know if you remember at the end of the book, I come out of the Battery Social Club, which is this new kind of elite club in downtown San Francisco, dressed up as an egalitarian place, but nothing like it. And I have a choice between a regular cab, which I can get into, which doesn't know me. I pay them cash. I don't know them. They don't know me. Or an Uber cab, which records everything I do. And not only that, they rate me as a customer. So if I'm rude, and I can be kind of obnoxious, as you can imagine in a cab, Uber drivers won't pick me up. I don't want to be known like that. We need anonymity. The beauty of the urban city, of the industrial city, is its anonymity. With networks like Uber, we're never anonymous. Not only do they know where we are, but they know everything about our behavior.
And I guess, yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And the other side of that is that, for example, when you take Uber as a case study and arguably the most loathsome of these companies, but the point is they all can, even if they don't do. They all have the ability to do what Uber has done or has threatened to do in terms of invading journalist privacy or lying to regulators or lying to. The fact that they don't do it is admirable, but the fact that they can should disturb every single individual, I would say.
Yeah, and that's why we need regulation on data. That's why we need regulation on protecting us from these incredibly exploitative companies. I mean, the one thing I guess one could say about Uber is its business model is based on taking revenue from fares rather than from the sale of our data. But given its free market fanaticism, one can also imagine them selling our data and generating revenue on that front. So again, the internet is currently not the answer because it's spawning really exploitative, creepy companies like Uber, which are making a fortune for a tiny group of people and which are bad news for the rest of us.
Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, but there are a couple other things I wanted to ask you about. We need to go to break. If you have a few more minutes.
Yeah, just like 3 more minutes. because I'm
all
in a
right,
bit
then
of a rush.
let's just wrap up now. Let's with a couple other things. We're talking with Andrew Keen, author of "The Internet Is Not the Answer." You mentioned data pollution. You mentioned, I did love the ending to the book, by the way. I won't spoil it for folks. But any last point you want to make before we let you go?
Well, the last point I would make is, and you've been very kind because I think you agree with a lot of what I'm saying. But my last point is that I'm not a Luddite. Some people will be listening and think, oh, this guy's just complaining about technology. He wants to go back to the cave. He wants to go back to the buggy whip. But that's not true. I'm as connected, as networked as anyone. I don't believe we can or even want to go back. But at the same time, we are moving into the future so fast with such abandon. Speed now is sort of redefining everything. And I think we need to think more carefully about where we're going. There's nothing inevitable about technology. And unless we can humanize it, unless we can define where we want it to go, we're going to become its slave. Of course, we haven't even talked about artificial intelligence. We haven't talked about the way in which this technology undermines jobs. But that's a huge subject, which I also address in the book.
Right, and perhaps, who knows, perhaps you can come back and we can talk about a couple of those things as well. And also, as you've said, and even in your preface, I think that the internet is not the answer yet. Maybe at some point we'll talk about what might make it more of an answer than it is today. But for now, it's been a great conversation. I encourage people to read the book, The Internet Is Not the Answer. Andrew Keen, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Rich, and I'd love to come back. Maybe we can have a whole session on employment, robots, artificial intelligence, because it's a massive issue.
It's a deal. All right. Thanks again. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Richard Eskow, and we will be back after this. This is The Zero Hour.